Chapter 26. After the release of Alive, things felt different. It was like watching water simmer before it boils. It suddenly seemed like just a matter of time before things would explode. An electricity pulsed through the audience at shows. There was a church-like fervor that gave our shows in late 1975 a holy roller quality. Up to then, we had made steady progress, so I never questioned that it would happen for us eventually. And despite the grave financial problems, the extent of which I probably never grasped at the time, I never worried that our modest album sales would cause the demise of the band. But on the other hand, we were running out of bigger bands to play with, pissing off headliners with our outrageous show, and our options were dwindling. Then, when Alive came out, the doors just got blown off. The game changed overnight. Suddenly, we headlined venues bigger than we had played before, even as openers. I was a bit nervous in the beginning because I didn't have the experience of communicating with 20,000 people. Once I figured it out, it was the audience whose nerves sparked, not mine. But at first, I had to learn to communicate with the person in the back row. I had to send energy all the way to the back to project the atmosphere of game show, circus, religious revival we prided ourselves on creating. The bigger the crowd, the harder you have to work. Everything had to be amped up 20,000 times, and I felt anointed to do it. Let me at them. I want to be what they want. I want to be the star child. I want us to be Kiss. I want to show them we are exactly who they think we are. It took me time and some trial and error, but soon enough I knew I could do it. In fact, I knew I was pretty damned good at it. The difference between a guy who has just gotten his commercial flying license and a seasoned pilot is that the first one knows how to fly the jet, while the other one knows how to deal with any and all situations. I quickly logged enough flight time that nothing fazed me. This is your captain speaking, and you're in good hands. When I got out there on stage, I really did get off on seeing everyone else get off. Crowds at our shows were ecstatic, and we were all sharing in the jubilation. Our joy matched the joy our fans experienced, and they kept my insecurities and unhappiness at bay. All the problems in the world, theirs and ours, would still be there tomorrow, but we were going to have a great time tonight. We also got to take a few heroes of mine out on tour with us. That fall of 1975, we had both Slade and Wizard, the band fronted by Roy Wood of The Move, open shows for us. Roy Wood's band created an eccentric version of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. His bass player wore roller skates. They were booed off stage. Afterwards, I told Roy what a huge influence he had been on me. He was still shell-shocked from getting booed, and I was disappointed not to get much of a reaction from him. After the first show we played with Slade, we all stayed in the Chattanooga Choo Choo Hilton, a hotel with vintage rail cars as rooms, all lined up on tracks behind the main building. I was a huge fan of Slade, and in fact, the mirrored top hat I had seen guitar-playing frontman Noddy Holder wearing in concert years before was the inspiration for my cracked mirror guitar. I dropped in to say hello to Noddy in his train car. He was completely delirious, so intoxicated he was incoherent and unable to stand. Your idols don't loom quite as large when they're horizontal. We had a couple of days off and flew to New York in the midst of things exploding. When I got home to my apartment in Queens, I found shotguns in the bedroom closet. Whoa, what the hell are these? My girlfriend Amanda had started hanging around with some unsavory types she'd befriended while I was on tour. They stashed weapons at our place. Great. I was just a Jewish kid from Queens. The only guns I'd ever seen were the kind you used to knock over a doll at the carnival to win a prize, the kind with a cork attached to the barrel with a string. She was descending into a completely different life. Amanda also told me that Joe Namath had given her a lift home from a club one night while I was gone. It was only after I thought about it a little that a light bulb went off in my head and I realized Joe Namath wouldn't drive girls to their doors and just give them a peck on the cheek. I had never lied about my activities on the road since I told her my mantra of, "Don't ask me what happens on the road if you don't want to know." Somehow it never dawned on me that the same would obviously be true of her. Don't ask me what happens at home if you don't want to know. I told her things were over between us, although it was clearly half-hearted on my part because she came along just the same when I moved into Manhattan and rented a place on East 52nd Street. We never had any pretenses of being in love anyway. We were bed buddies, but it was time to change the sheets. The apartment was in a tall luxury building on a street that dead-ended at the East River. Construction on the building had just been completed. When I went to look at it, they offered 2 apartments. One on the 21st floor went for $510 a month. Another on the 26th floor with a beautiful view cost $560. Despite our recent upturn, $50 a month was a huge difference. I took the place on the 21st floor. My new apartment was tangible proof of my ascension. I went to Macy's and bought my first real furniture. A big L-shaped green velvet couch, and one of those huge ball-shaped lamps that hangs from a tall, arching metal stand. I felt very cool. Another change brought about by the immediate success of Alive was an upgrade in hotels. We graduated from Holiday Inns to Sheratons. At the Sheraton, the towels had embroidered S logos on them. Whenever we were about to have a break and return to New York, I would stuff a set into my suitcase. Soon, I had a cabinet full of monogrammed towels at my new luxury apartment. Bill Aucoin liked to see us live an extravagant life on the road once things started to pop, and he started to repay his massive personal debt. We enjoyed it too until we got a little wiser and saw the bills. In the dressing rooms now, people asked us what we would like to drink. It only seemed natural to ask for champagne. How cool, champagne! We ordered several bottles of bubbly, not realizing everything we ordered was charged to us. But it was fun, and besides, who knew how long this all would last? We certainly weren't born businessmen. Whatever the myth, we were totally green and not savvy at all about tour expenses or bottom lines. We trusted the people around us to have our best interests at heart. It took years for us to learn the ropes and to consider trying to change the way things were done. In the meantime, I felt newly flush, whatever the reality. One day off in New York, I went to 48th Street to pick up some things at a music store. It was a strange situation because we had gotten quite famous more or less overnight, and yet very few people recognized us without the makeup. I could walk the streets or get a cup of coffee. I could even go to a newsstand and buy music magazines with photos of Kiss in them. Of course, it was different on 48th Street. I didn't look like everybody else. I had the blue-black hair and the street versions of my 7-inch platforms, which I wore all the time. I guess there, among all the music aficionados, people could put 2 and 2 together when they saw a 6'8" guy with mounds of blue-black curls walk in. If that guy isn't in Kiss, the circus must be in town. When I went to check out, carrying a couple sets of strings and a few other things, the shop owner wanted to give it all to me for free. I didn't understand. "It's on us," the guy insisted. The irony was not lost on me. "I can afford it," I said. "I can buy it. Give it to the next guy who comes in and really needs it." Chapter 27. On New Year's Eve 1975, we headlined the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island, New York. Exactly 2 years before, we had played another New Year's Eve show, opening for Iggy and Blue Oyster Cult at the Academy of Music. This time, Blue Oyster Cult opened for us. Things were really cooking. Backstage at that show, we received gold albums recognizing Alive for surpassing 500,000 copies shipped since its release in September. Everything else we had accomplished that year had been the stuff of my fantasies, whether it was moving up to headlining status, climbing the hotel chain ladder, or getting a Manhattan apartment. But receiving a gold record fulfilled a childhood dream. Elvis had gold albums. The Beatles had gold albums. Now I had a gold album. The aftermath of the show was less rewarding. We had about 2 weeks off before we started the next leg of the tour, and I went home to 52nd Street and Amanda. Things with her had continued to go south, and this time when I got home, I saw track marks on her arm. Another couple she had befriended trafficked drugs into the country, major league stuff, and I knew that even as a relationship of convenience, this wasn't going to work anymore. I didn't want guns to start turning up again. I didn't want to hear phone messages about shipments arriving, and I didn't want a junkie around. "This is over and you've got to leave," I told her. She didn't want to. Ultimately, I moved out for the final week of our tour break and stayed at an empty place Bill Aucoin had. I wasn't quite sure why he maintained a spare apartment, but I didn't care. Amanda and I had been fighting for several days when I left, and as I was going out the door of the building, the doorman called to me and said, "Mr. Stanley, she says she's going to jump." "Tell her not to land on me," I said, and left. Soon we went back on tour. I called Amanda's mother and told her to fly to New York and get Amanda out while I was gone. On January 31st, 1976, Kiss headlined Hara Arena in Dayton, Ohio. Before the show, I could hear a deep rumbling sound, the commotion of a big crowd, excitement. Every night I asked the tour manager, "How are we doing tonight?" The answer had been good for a long run now since Alive had taken off. That night he said, "Sold out." The four of us were celebrating, jubilant at the knowledge that we were taking it to that next level. We were now a credible headliner, a real headliner. Kiss was becoming one of those bands, the type we had looked up to. We had graduated. A curtain always shrouded the stage before we went on. It wasn't the elaborate kabuki we have now, but there was always a curtain. In Dayton that night, I opened it a little and peered out. The place was packed. The energy of the crowd was almost frightening. I felt a nervousness in the pit of my stomach, the same feeling you get as a roller coaster makes the long, slow climb up the initial hill. That's what Hara Arena felt like to me. Then, the next night, when I asked the tour manager how we were doing again, he said, "Sold out." And again the next night, and the night after that. And all of a sudden, we sold out everywhere. It was no longer an anomaly. Kiss was a band selling out arenas every night. Once the floodgates opened, everything happened so fast. The pressure had been building up all this time, and then it exploded. There was no turning back. And yet I was just a kid. I was 24 years old, and the depth of my comprehension was fairly limited. Yes, this was tremendous. Yes, it was unbelievable. Yes, this was how I had planned it and envisioned it. But as it started to happen, the success of the band was overwhelming. It was frightening. The roller coaster feeling I'd had at Hara Arena became a more or less constant sensation. I was being pulled up the big hill, knowing we were going to reach the top at any moment and then plunge down the other side, falling, screaming, with no control whatsoever. I could feel the momentum, the process of being pulled up the hill. I could tell we had reached a point of no return. All I could do was hold on real tight. The problem was, what did I have to hold on to? Nothing. I had no emotionally meaningful connections in my life. God knew the guys in the band weren't going to be any help. The world we operated in now was littered with casualties of fame. Drugs were offered as a sign of friendship every single day. People became self-destructive. People numbed themselves. People died. Because of my insecurities and self-doubt, I was scared I would fall prey to the same temptations. My sense of self-preservation kicked in. I'm going to need something to hold on to. This thing was going to careen down the hill at any moment, whether I was prepared or not. Then I thought of Dr. Jesse Hilson. Back in those days, people sometimes dismissed therapy as a crutch or considered it a sign of weakness. I myself had bought into that enough to stop going to Mount Sinai once life seemed to be going more smoothly as Wicked Lester came together. I wanted to believe I was okay, but I wasn't. I called Mount Sinai. Dr. Hilson had left the hospital and gone into private practice, but I tracked him down. My band is about to become huge, I explained. I don't know if I can handle that world. I need a lifeline. I was determined to survive. Perhaps therapy would be the way I kept my 7-inch heels planted on the ground. Part 3. I've been up and down, I've been all around. Chapter 28. Early in 1976, when we were getting ready to make our next studio album, Bill Aucoin said, "You can either use Kiss Alive as a springboard to take you to another level, or you can be a one-hit wonder that just goes right back to doing what you were doing before." He had a point. To go back to what we had done earlier did seem stupid. After all, it didn't work before Alive, so why would it work now? The reason our first 3 albums didn't sell was because listeners didn't like the way they sounded. There was something intrinsically wrong with them, though I still couldn't have put my finger on exactly what it was. Bill suggested we bring in Bob Ezrin to produce the new record. Bob was already known for the great records he'd made with Alice Cooper, and he proved to have a vast musical vocabulary. It turned out to be a brilliant move on Bill's part. Bob was a gift. We may have had a huge album under our belts, but we still didn't know anything more than we did before Alive became a hit. Still, for a bunch of guys who thought they were hot shit, it was initially jarring to go into a studio with someone who treated us like children. As we began work on what would become Destroyer, Bob made a point of letting us know he was the boss. He wore a whistle around his neck and referred to us as campers. He told us we didn't know anything, which was true. He told us never to stop playing until he said so. Once at the end of a take, long after a fade-out would have ended the recording, Gene stopped playing. Bob came out of the control room and ran up to him, stuck his finger so close to Gene's nose that it made his eyes cross, and said, "Don't you ever, ever stop until I tell you to stop." A trickle of sweat ran down Gene's forehead. He never stopped again. It was humbling, particularly at a time when we thought we were God's gift to rock and roll and finally had a record to back up our claim. Alive was platinum by this point. But Bob clearly knew a lot more than we did. He was trained, he was worthy of respect, and he taught us a lot. One of the most significant things he did was challenge us not to write "fuck me, suck me" songs. No more "I'm a rock star, suck my dick," he insisted. And as we worked on lyrics, he had no problem saying very plainly, "No, I don't like that." I would never have written a lyric like Detroit Rock City without Bob upping our game. He pushed us far beyond our limits. During the process of making the record, Bob lived in an apartment directly across the street from my place on 52nd Street. He had a piano, and when we weren't in the rehearsal space or studio, I spent a lot of time there. Gene and I also sometimes took amplifiers over to his place and worked. We wrote Shout It Out Loud at Bob's apartment. The riff in God of Thunder reflected the way my limitations as a guitar player were key to what I came up with and probably helped make my songs identifiable and unique. That riff was a compromise between what I heard in my head and what I could actually play. Another example of that process was I Want You, which ended up on the next album. Sometimes at the rehearsal space, Bob would have the four of us sit in a circle and he would say, "Who's got an idea? Anybody have an idea for a verse? Who's got a part?" Someone would play a snippet and he might say, "No." Then somebody else would play something and Bob would shout, "Okay, that's good. Now who has another part?" A lot of the songs came together like that, pieces of this and that stitched together with input from Bob. Peter sat at his drums while we threw out ideas. When it came time to arrange finished songs, Bob often came up with parts. Once I saw him work with us, I understood Alice Cooper's albums much more. I could see Bob's point of view in them. Bob's fingerprints were all over things like Billion Dollar Babies. Suddenly, I could hear his drum parts and his bass parts. I knew them from our stuff, like the bass line in Detroit Rock City, which Bob created. That bass part is similar to the bass in Curtis Mayfield's Freddie's Dead. Bob even came up with the guitar solo on Detroit Rock City. He sang it to Ace and made him figure it out. Bob was brilliant at that kind of stuff. When it came time for the drums, we faced a real challenge. Bob spent many, many hours teaching Peter his parts. Bob came up with most of the drum parts on the album, and he would dismiss the rest of us for hours at a time to work with Peter. Detroit Rock City in particular had a very challenging drum beat, and it took a lot of effort and patience for Bob to get Peter to be able to play something he couldn't have learned to play on his own if his life had depended on it. Back then, there were no click tracks, which allow a drummer to work with a sort of metronome to get a consistent tempo. But to get a track the way he wanted it, Bob liked to be able to cut and splice from various takes we recorded, which necessitated a steady pace. That would have been difficult in our case, to say the least. So Bob created a human click track. He sat in the control room with a mic stuck into a hole in a cigar box and tapped the beat on the box and fed it to all of us, most importantly, Peter. Bob also wrote the lion's share of Beth, using a few lines and a melody Peter brought in. Peter had a co-writer on every song he ever wrote because he couldn't really write. Song structure and concepts like making your lyrics rhyme were totally lost on him. In the case of Beth, Bob wrote most of it, even though the original idea Peter brought in had already been done with a co-writer. To get the vocal for Beth, Bob had to record Peter singing the song probably a dozen times and cobble together a single version from the passable parts of those takes. Peter's chances of being able to sing a song off the cuff were about as good as my chances of throwing a penny and hitting the moon. It would be a challenge for him to carry a tune in a bucket. Even if we sang a note to him, he couldn't find it. But since we had always presented our Beatles-based fantasy to the world, 4 band members all contributing equally, at some point Peter began to believe his own press. Perception became reality to him, despite the fact that we created the perception ourselves. We made it out as if we lived like the Help-era Beatles and all made music together as equals. But that was never the case. And who should know that better than the people who were actually there and not contributing? Peter and Ace's contributions were never as substantial as we made them out to be in the press. The fact of the matter was that 2 guys, Gene and me, were the engineers and motivators and did 80% of the work. Unfortunately, when we decided to create the help illusion, we never considered the possibility that Peter and Ace would start to actually believe it and that their belief would bite us in the ass. But sure enough, their delusion started to create resentment and eventually fatal fissures in the band. Those fissures first started opening during Destroyer, as Peter struggled to record a song that was ostensibly his own, and we began to have to work around Ace, who spent much of the recording process with his priorities far from where they belonged. He sometimes played his parts with his rings and chains scraping against the fretboard and pickups and then wanted to quit for the day and take off. When I would ask him to remove the jewelry and do another take because of all the noise, he would say, "Hey, that's rock and roll. No, Ace, that's shit." His alcohol abuse is well documented, but Ace also didn't hesitate to just up and leave the studio to go play cards with friends. I could not wrap my head around that at all. Leaving the job to get loaded and play cards, even if it meant having another guitar player handle his parts? Making music was my dream, and skipping out on that process was something I couldn't fathom. Sonically, Bob Ezrin didn't try to recreate the bombast of Alive with its huge broken-up guitars and screaming vocals. He found power in other ways. He created an atmosphere of grandeur. He brought in elements of things I loved, like the orchestral bells on Do You Love Me. He gave guitar chords heft by layering them with a grand piano playing the same parts. In some ways, it reminded me of what I liked about Roy Wood and Wizard, that big, chaotic version of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Bob added things that really struck emotional chords in me. He was also the first producer we worked with who finally understood the subtleties we didn't understand about using different guitars for different parts, or doubling a guitar with a different guitar, or slowing down the tape slightly and doubling the guitar over it to make the sound bigger because of the slight discrepancy in the tuning. Bob knew the essence of great production and great arrangements, and he brought it to bear on Destroyer in a way I thought was groundbreaking for the type of music we made. Wow, this is what a real producer does. From that point on, unless someone could tell us what was wrong with what we were doing and how to correct it, whether it was a problem with the song itself or with the sonics, I considered that person an engineer, not a producer. With the album wrapped up, the Alive tour continued. We had a few days off in LA, and I got together with Karen, the hostess from the Rainbow. The band and I had reached a level of success that transformed my relationship with her into a physical one. I took this as a kind of validation. Now I really was a rock star of a different caliber. It was gratifying, and it seemed like a normal and logical evolution. I was also now in a position to rent luxury cars for my use, so one of the days in LA, I rented a 2-seater Mercedes and picked Karen up at her apartment to go for a drive up the coast. About 45 minutes on the road, it started to pour. That's when the reality hit me in the face, along with the oncoming rain, that I had no idea how to raise the top. We drove back to her place in the rain with the top still down, never speaking of the obvious. We were both soaking wet when we arrived, and I finally admitted the truth. After a quick laugh together, I got right to the most pressing issue. Do you have a hairdryer I can use? Near the tail end of the tour, we stopped in Hawaii. None of us had ever been there before, and now we had a gig in Honolulu and a few days off to spend there afterward. The day after the show, our pyro guy and some others, including Rick Stewart, a security guard charged with looking after me, rented a catamaran. Now, right away, you should know not to do anything risky with a pyro guy. No offense to pyro guys, but they got a hard on making things go boom, whether that meant making a living at it or winding up in jail. The line between pyro guys and arsonists was very fine back then. I decided not to be a wuss and went along. Sailing a boat is something better done with people who know what they're doing. Instead, I was out there with a pyro guy and Rick, whom everyone called the Dobe, as in Doberman, because of the studded dog collar he wore around his neck. I thought we would just parallel the shore, which was scary enough for me, but we wound up heading out to sea. As we headed out, another boat coming in yelled to us, "Be real careful! The tide's tricky and we had trouble getting back in." Great. That wasn't what I wanted to hear sitting on a cloth suspended between two pontoons of a catamaran. Things on shore kept getting smaller and smaller. What the fuck am I doing? I'd read enough Reader's Digest stories about people stuck on rafts for a month, eating seagulls and trying to catch turtles. It's going to happen to me. I panicked and jumped off the boat. I'm going to swim to shore. As the catamaran continued to slice its way out and away from me, I yelled at Rick, "Do something!" The Dobe jumped in and swam toward me. Now both of us flailed against the riptide, unable to make any progress toward shore. We made our way sideways to a pair of surfers bobbing on their boards. "We can't get in," I said. "Can you help us?" "Fuck off," the guy said, catching a wave and leaving us out there. After a few minutes, I was struggling to keep my head above water, and every time I dipped down, my feet hit the spikes of sea urchins, which jabbed painfully at my soles. I looked at the shore and saw hundreds of people enjoying themselves. They weren't very far away, but they were totally unaware that we were going to die. I don't matter. People tossed balls around or lay on towels relaxing. The most important person in the world was dying, and the world went on. Nobody matters. Despite how much we fought, Mother Nature kept pushing our heads below the water. Just as I thought it was all over, that I was going to drown a few hundred feet from a beach full of people who wouldn't notice if I died, a little motorboat pulled up and people grabbed me and the Dobe and dragged us out of the water. In the motorboat sat the owner of the catamaran we had rented. He'd been worried that we didn't know how to use the boat properly and had tracked us with binoculars as we sailed out. He saw us jump off and came out with his motorboat, realizing the tide would at the very least strand us. I lay in the bottom of the boat. My head throbbed and my feet throbbed around the black spots where the sea urchin spikes had lodged in them like big splinters. That was close. Back at the hotel, I went upstairs and tried to pull out the spikes. Nothing doing. They just broke off. I called the front desk. "I stepped on sea urchins. What do I do to get the spikes out of my feet?" "Pee in the sink and put your feet in it," the voice said. Very funny, but seriously, what do I do? That's what you do. As if the day hadn't been interesting enough, there I was pissing in the bathroom sink and then hoisting myself up onto the counter to soak my punctured soles in it. Mahalo. Chapter 29. By the time Destroyer was certified gold, in April 1976, we were solidly in the black after digging ourselves, and especially Bill, out of hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt incurred during the first 2 years of touring. But we still weren't making much money ourselves. Touring, even now that we sold out arenas, didn't fill the coffers of the band members. A manager took 20% of the gross from a show right off the top, and salaries and production expenses easily ate up another 50%, leaving the rest to be split among the four of us. That reality was still lost on us. Standard business practices meant we did the work while others took most of the money. I still lived in a rented apartment and didn't even own a car. One night a reporter asked me, "What does it feel like to be rich and famous?" "Well," I said, "I can tell you what it's like to be famous." That was all about to change. Bill O'Coin always saw the bigger picture. He could tell that we connected with our fans in a way that far exceeded the norm. He grasped the extent to which people would respond to us beyond the music. He understood the potential of merchandising. When I first saw the tour program Bill created for the later stages of the Alive tour, I had never seen anything like it. He never told us he was going to do it. He just showed up one day and said, "Here's the tour program." After paging through its 24 pages, I thought it was terrific. Bill also thought, and was quickly proved correct, that our fans would want T-shirts and belt buckles. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. He founded an in-house merchandising company together with a guy named Ron Boutwell. Initially, the company fulfilled orders from our fan club. Bill just announced to us, very matter-of-factly, we're going to start marketing merchandise. It could not have happened without Bill. There's a myth out there that we took part in a grand plan right from the beginning. That is not the truth. We were clueless about merchandising. Nobody in the band was ever involved with the merchandising plan. Eventually, we started to have a hand in it, but that came over time. All we provided at first was the template. The music was ours, the makeup was ours, but so much of the rest was Bill's. Obviously, we were the nucleus of everything that happened, but in terms of the reach of the Kiss image through merchandising, we had no more to do with that than we'd had with the fire-breathing or the levitating drum set. I'm a big believer in promoting the team because you're only as good as the team. It's the team that wins the game. We weren't brilliant businessmen, and there wasn't a brilliant Madison Avenue company behind us. There was just Bill, who, like us, wasn't held back by perceived limitations. He just pushed forward with an innate sense of what he could accomplish. Bill wanted to maximize our potential on all fronts. We certainly weren't going to be marketed like Led Zeppelin. And we had more to offer than just music. We were naturals for merchandising, even if we didn't realize it ourselves at first. Back then, the breadth of Kiss merchandise was often scoffed at. But I looked to the Beatles. You could get Beatles dolls and shirts after they made it big, so what was wrong with it? Obviously, nobody wanted Deep Purple dolls, but why would they? Without disrespecting their music, a lot of the bands of the day had a fairly nondescript, forgettable look. But Kiss had visual appeal. That was the nature of Kiss, the beauty of Kiss, so I understood the desire to market us that way, and I never thought it detracted from the band. I just wanted to be sure there was substance. In this respect, Gene and I had some differences. If someone came to us and said, let's make a Kiss cake, Gene would say, let's make it 10 feet high with lights all over it. I would say, that's great, but what will the cake be like? How will it taste? That other stuff is cool, but we need to have a great cake underneath. Without that, we have nothing. Sizzle was great, but you needed the steak. That remained my concern as the merchandising took off. Sometimes I wondered how far would be too far. Were there things we shouldn't do? But at that point, the answer was no. It all seemed good, phenomenal even. Kiss radios, Kiss motorcycles, Kiss lunchboxes. As the money started to flow from Bill's merchandising concept, as well as continued sales of Alive, I have to say I was impressed. It was exhilarating to hear about money going into our personal accounts. We still drew a fairly modest weekly salary and didn't take physical possession of the rest of the money, but we were told about it. Again, we didn't know much about what was going on. We didn't understand the various revenue streams, where they came from or where they went. None of it. In the midst of this maelstrom, Howard Marks, who was Bill's boss, approached us with an offer to manage our money. Howard had an advertising agency that had created the album cover for Alive and then put together the brilliant covers for our next 3 albums. Howard said to us, there are a lot of sharks in the business, and you're going to need somebody to look after your finances. It happened that Howard had a best friend who was a wealthy businessman in Cleveland named Carl Glickman. Howard volunteered to form a company with his friend to take care of our finances. His concern for our welfare made him feel all the more like family to us. How great is this? How lucky are we? The new financial company, Glickman Marks, held regular meetings to update us on money matters and soon started sending someone on the road with us to serve as an accountant along the way. It never occurred to us that the road rep's taste for fine wine, expensive food, and paid companionship might be compromising nightly box office settlements. What we did notice was that the company built personal financial portfolios for us. I mean, hey, we owned an industrial park in Cincinnati at one point. At the financial meetings, we asked things like, how much did we make rather than how much came in? And because the figures we heard as answers to the first question sounded very impressive to kids like us, who had no experience of making real money, we never asked the second one or its logical follow-up. How much are you making? Bill soon moved his office to an entire floor of a building at 645 Madison Avenue and ultimately rented another floor in the same building. Bill's marketing of the band's imagery expanded our appeal beyond a rock audience. One afternoon back in New York, I went into a jean shop on 59th Street. The register sat atop a glass display case, and on the case was a sticker Bill had distributed to promote Destroyer that featured the fantastical graphic novel-style album cover image of the four of us painted by Ken Kelly. As I was poking around the shop, a mom and her little boy walked up to the counter. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 4, pointed to the image. "Kiss," he said. "Cool. We are more than a band." A band makes music, a phenomenon impacts society. And if a kid who had no idea about music recognized Kiss, weren't we a phenomenon? Not long after that, in May 1976, we jetted off to England for a 2-month European tour. To me, England represented the musical Holy Land. Everything I loved came from there. We even had 2 nights booked at the Hammersmith Odeon in London, where so many of my favorite bands had played legendary gigs. But nearly as soon as we landed, I hated it. We had become a big band in the United States. In England and the rest of Europe, we had to prove ourselves all over again. We were back at square one. Nobodies. Thank God for the fans. As we had seen back home when we started out, the fans in England were also rabid in their dedication to us. On the other hand, the food was horrible and the transportation archaic. The people who ran things were very stodgy. Merchants took perverse pride in the fact that you couldn't get dry cleaning back for a week. There was no air conditioning, and if you pleaded, they might begrudgingly put one lone ice cube in a drink for you. These things were badges of honor to the older guard of the British Empire. But the hotel policies represented the biggest sore spot. They made it virtually impossible to take female guests to your room. You had to sign them in, and they had to leave by 10 p.m., and the staff enforced the rules. Trouble taking girls to our rooms was a much bigger problem than the food. I could go without food, but I couldn't go without a steady diet of wild and willing women. That was absolutely essential. Ace bought knives all along the European tour, and on the way home, he taped a bunch of them to the inside of his Marshall cabinets to sneak them into the country. It pissed me off. If they were found, all our gear would be impounded. But it was par for the course for Ace. Once on a domestic flight, our tour manager's bags had been searched and a stolen hotel phone was found. The tour manager hadn't put it in there. Ace also stashed drugs in the bags or pockets of crew members without their knowledge, so he wasn't on the hook if they were found. Ace was all about Ace, regardless of the cost to anyone else. Arriving in the middle of the night back at my apartment on 52nd Street after a month in Europe, the doorman stopped me as I walked in with my suitcase. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yeah, very funny. I live here," I said. I kept walking toward the elevator. "Sir, if you don't stop, I'm going to call the police." I was gone a lot. And I was soon gone again. As the tour continued back in the States, the strain of dealing with the splintering personalities in the band meant we shuffled through more and more tour managers. All told, during the first 5 years of the band, we probably went through 20 tour managers. Among the most colorful was Fat Frankie Skinlaro, an old-school manager who had worked with Joey D and the Starlighters. His upbeat nature was contagious. He had a lot of nicknames for us. He called Peter the Ayatollah Criscola. Gene was Gene the Nazarene, and I was the he-she because of my preening and dancing on stage. We'd begun to call Ace Baby Elvis because he was developing such a paunch. He ate a lot of potato salad, and in general, he ate with his mouth open. He said it aerated the food. It was like watching a cement mixer. Fat Frankie would do anything to get us laughing, and when he did, tensions within the band faded. He could be really self-deprecating, too. He liked to say, "I may have a little dick, but I can make it spin." Some of the tour managers were fired because Bill didn't think they were doing a good job. Most were ousted because of jealousies within the band. Each member wanted the undivided attention of the road manager, or at least a sense of favoritism. When one of us didn't get that person not coincidentally began to think the road manager was no good. A lot of them quit, too. Even people who had worked with other bands couldn't deal with the growing friction in ours. It was just too trying to have four hyperactive, dysfunctional people demanding all your attention and, if they didn't get it, sabotaging you so you fell on your ass. Through all the changes in road managers and crew, the only constant was Bill. He had a way of diffusing tension and making each member of the band think he was his favorite. But Bill, too, was increasingly stretched thin. He had started trying to expand his management business and seemed to spend a lot of time now on acts like Piper, Stars, and Toby Bow. We felt somewhat spited. We made all the money, and now he spent most of his time dealing with these baby acts who never went far. Sean Delaney's attention was also diverted by these other acts, and I was annoyed by the way Bill now seemed to believe that the formula for success was simple. Give a band a look and a logo, and they would become as big as Kiss. That was insulting. Bill and Sean's ideas had definitely helped us immeasurably, but our success wasn't so simple. There was more to us than a logo, platform boots, and makeup. Ever since I'd haunted 48th Street as a kid, I had admired the vintage guitars that cost a fortune. Now, however, I was ready to start collecting them. I put the word out on that leg of the tour that I wanted to buy guitars. The first exotic instrument I bought was a Gibson SG doubleneck, like the one Jimmy Page played. I bought it in Indiana from a guy who collected them and had a room full of doublenecks. Most of them were cherry, but this one was sunburst. From then on, the promoters knew I was in the market, and often a line of people with guitar cases would be standing at the truck entrance to the concert venues when we pulled in. It was terrific. You never knew what might turn up. I bought my next one in Arizona from a guy who owned a store called Bob's Bizarre Guitars. That was a sunburst Les Paul, exactly what I'd always wanted, and I paid $2,200 for it. I couldn't believe I finally had one of those guitars. It had what are called white or cream humbuckers. The bobbins, where the copper wire is wound, were white. You don't usually see the color of the bobbin because they are encased in a chrome or nickel case on the old guitars. But if you looked under the casing, the bobbins could be black, white, or what was called zebra, meaning it had one white and one black. Most of the guitars had all black bobbins, which was considered the least desirable setup. The most coveted ones had two white bobbins. I was over the moon. Chapter 30. You're millionaires, our financial advisors happily told us one day in late 1976. Beth had become a chart hit and crossed over to AM radio. Destroyer had become our second platinum album. We had played our biggest show ever to 42,000 fans at the California Angels baseball stadium in Anaheim, California in late August. Our in-house merchandising business was booming. Being told you're a millionaire definitely sounds impressive, but it didn't hit me with the same heft that getting that first gold album had. That was a true milestone that I could quite literally grasp. This was great, but it wasn't the same concrete accomplishment. And it was also hard to figure out what it really meant since the money was still something abstract. I still lived in my one-bedroom apartment. But now we had 2 months off in New York to let the news sink in and to record a new album. I bought my parents a Chrysler. It was the first time they had ever owned a new car. I also bought them a house not long after when my dad lost his job and his pension. Instead of possibly being on welfare and food stamps, they were in a new house with a new car. When Erica started school, she lived in a nice suburban school district and did extremely well. Many years down the road, she would ultimately get accepted to an elite university, and I felt blessed to be able to cover the costs for her. Even so, my dad called me stingy for keeping the deed to the house in my name. I was afraid he'd just sell it if it was in my parents' name. My dad told me that my success was more luck than anything else. In my experience, people who dismissed the success of others as luck were people who had failed. It was a way to absolve themselves of accountability for failure and discount someone else's role in their own accomplishments. And the idea that success was the result of luck also made other people feel entitled, as if the lucky ones should share their luck without reservation. After all, it could have happened to anyone. I saw this pattern in my family. I bought myself a Mercedes, a burgundy 450 SL with saddle interior. The first time I drove out to Queens in it to see my parents, I pulled into a parking spot a few blocks away from their place and paused, sitting in the car with the motor running. Should I really have bought this car? I switched on the radio. Rock and Roll All Night blared from the FM rock station. I pressed AM and spun the dial. I heard Beth. Yes, it was okay to buy the car. During our break in the fall of 1976, we went back into the studio to record Rock and Roll Over, which was released in November. It was our 6th album in less than 3 years' time. Our initial productivity as a band was all about keeping our heads above water. But just because we'd reached a certain level of financial security, I didn't see any reason not to remain productive. It was fun to go into the studio. I'd spent my whole life dreaming of being in the studio. The studio was also a place where I could hide out when we were off the road. I still had virtually no social life, very few friends, and the studio was a safe haven, and one where we now had carte blanche. I could go there and not have to keep my eye on the clock. Those bills would be paid without so much as a raised eyebrow. When Destroyer had come out earlier that year, the album had thrown some people because it didn't sound like us live. But it did capture the essence of what we did, by creating a cinematic feel that represented the magnitude of our shows, even if it didn't recreate the sound of our shows. Bob Ezrin had enhanced and broadened our sound. He had magnified the 4 characters. But when we asked people around us what they thought of it, they sometimes said things like, "It's different." Different is not a good word in that context. It's a word people use when they can't make up their minds whether they like something or not. The truth is, the change scared us too. Maybe we didn't want to have a nanny this time around either, someone telling us how to do everything and blowing a whistle in our faces. We figured we'd done our apprenticeship, and Peter and Ace certainly had no desire to work with Bob again. We decided to try a more meat-and-potatoes approach, go back to basics. The first thing we did was contact Jack Douglas, who had produced Aerosmith's 3 most recent albums, Get Your Wings, Toys in the Attic, and Rocks. The problem was that Jack was friends with Bob, and he turned around and told Bob we had asked him. It wasn't tactful on Bill's part not to tell Bob first. The whole thing blew up, and we felt like we'd been caught hitting on a friend's girlfriend. Then came the idea of going back to Eddie Kramer because Alive had been so good. We rented the Star Theater in Nanuet, New York, outside the city, but close enough that we could all go home at night. Eddie came on board, and we retreated to familiar territory as fast as we could. Even though Eddie was from South Africa, he had the air of an English gentleman. He was part of the heritage we all loved. One thing we hoped Eddie could fix was our drum sound. After all, he'd been part of getting that big drum sound Zeppelin had. He had Peter set up in the theater itself while we played in a studio elsewhere in the building. We linked Peter in by video camera. In theory, even a chimpanzee beating on pots and pans could sound thunderous in the right environment. But still, the drum sounded tinny. Soon, however, I came to the conclusion that in Zeppelin's case, John Bonham was that sound, and Peter Criss would never be John Bonham. Eddie didn't function as a musical director or visionary in terms of arrangements the way Bob had, and we missed that leadership. No one was there to help us write or shape songs. I was having trouble coming up with songs, so I asked Sean Delaney to come over to my apartment for writing sessions. Those informal get-togethers at my 52nd Street place yielded Makin' Love, Mr. Speed, and Take Me for Rock and Roll Over, as well as All American Man, which showed up on Alive 2 the following year. Hard Luck Woman was an anomaly because I never intended it for Kiss. I didn't see songwriting as an exercise, and normally I was good at self-editing. If I didn't think a song had a place on a Kiss album, I didn't bother to finish it. But I was still fascinated by trying to figure out what made certain songs by other people tick. I'd been listening to Rod Stewart's Maggie May and You Wear It Well with that in mind and decided to try my hand at something similar. The lyrical spark came from someplace completely different, a song called Brandy by Looking Glass that was about a sailor's daughter who worked at a bar. Once I finished the song, I couldn't imagine Kiss doing it. I planned to try to get it to Rod to see whether he wanted to record it. But with Beth doing so well that fall, Eddie Kramer and Gene both thought the song would make a logical follow-up for Kiss. And since Peter had that type of raspy voice like Rod's, we figured he should sing it. I had to record a vocal for Peter to follow, and again, he took many takes to provide enough material to cobble together a finished version. The situation within the band had deteriorated even in the space of 6 months since we made Destroyer. Peter brought in a cassette with a disjointed sketch of a song called Baby Driver. He always brought tapes with recordings he'd done with co-writers because he couldn't play us a song any other way since he didn't play any instruments. Peter lashed out when we worked on his songs, but the problem wasn't that Gene and I rewrote his songs. The problem was that the things Peter brought in weren't songs to begin with. The lyrics never rhymed. There weren't any delineations between verse and chorus. They were scraps, not songs. Yes, the band was stronger when everyone participated, but somebody had to lay down the law when something simply wasn't good enough. Bob performed that role on Destroyer, created Beth for Peter, and guided us all creatively. Now that it fell to us, it was futile to try to hold Peter to the same standard we insisted on for the rest of the material. There was leeway because, hey, we wanted a Peter song. That was part of the image of Kiss, and now because of Beth, Peter expected to write the songs he sang instead of singing mine, Gene's, or Ace's. But even with the additional wiggle room as far as quality, we couldn't let his stuff undermine the integrity of a record. Of course, for Peter's co-writer, getting a song credit on a Kiss album was a gravy train, so Peter always pushed his buddies' ideas and made a stink if anyone suggested they weren't quite up to scrub. Peter spent all his emotional energy worrying about his place in the hierarchy without the ability to be honest with himself about the quality of what he brought to the table. Ace was a shadow of his former self. He had been a bright light that looked as if it could explode. He had the talent to be as good as he thought he was. The potential was there for him to have been one of the all-time greats, but the booze and Valium and Coke and whatever else now left him incapacitated almost all the time. We prayed we'd be able to get a solo out of him before he passed out. He wasn't funny anymore, in any way. When he tried to tell jokes, he had to stop and slur, "How's it go again?" The situation sometimes made me angry. I had busted my ass for the band, and I felt that these two guys were playing fast and loose with my future based on their irrational whims and inner conflicts. And yet, because the deterioration took place in stages, I found I accepted things I never would have initially. If you try to bend a tree down to the ground, it breaks. If you bend it incrementally, little by little, you can get it parallel to the ground without snapping it. It just took time. That was me. There was very little band mentality anymore. The other three guys drifted off to their own social circles, and we all had our own people telling each of us how great we were. Between their sycophantic friends and all the press, Peter and Ace began to believe they were world-class virtuosos despite mounting evidence to the contrary. When we argued with Peter over his songs, he'd say things like, "You just don't want me to do this because I wrote the biggest song," or "You don't want me to do this because I'm the best singer." And he constantly accused me of not having paid my dues, apparently because I hadn't spent a decade before Kiss playing in bands that went nowhere like he had. Both Peter and Ace were fucked up all the time. I'd seen plenty of functional addicts. Bob Ezrin had been doing a lot of coke and chugging Remy Martin while we recorded Destroyer, but the quality of his work never flagged. Bill O'Coin, Neil Bogart, and much of the Casablanca staff were on a slippery slope doing lots of drugs, too. Drugs and alcohol were like a Ferrari. There's a split-second difference between being in control and being wrapped around a telephone pole. You're in control, and then you pass that line and don't realize it until it's too late. I hoped Bill would be able to save Peter and Ace, but that turned out to be foolish. Bill couldn't even save himself. If Gene and I tried to diffuse unpleasant situations by saying, "Come on, man, that's the drugs talking," Peter and Ace would respond by insisting they knew exactly what they were saying. Peter's insecurities got more and more crippling with the addition of drugs. The whole world was against him. One day in the studio, he exploded about something and smashed my acoustic 12-string guitar against the wall. There was a moment of deafening silence after that. During another argument, Gene snapped at Peter, "Peter, you're an illiterate idiot who can't read or even talk correctly and never finished school." "Yeah," said Peter, "and I'm in the same band as you." To this day, that remains the smartest thing I ever heard Peter say. Chapter 31. One night in Texas, in early 1977, a youth group attending a Bible conference gathered in the lobby of our hotel. Trying to be kind, generous, and Christian, one of them walked over to me and said, "I'm going to pray for you." "How dare you?" I said. "What would possibly make you think I need you to pray for me?" Whatever judgments they had of me, it didn't stop a group of them from pressing themselves against my hotel room connecting door to listen to this messenger of Satan strip a willing local of her clothes and inhibitions. When we pulled into arenas now, we saw people brandishing banners and placards and carrying crosses. I was astonished. These people quoted the Bible and called our music satanic. "You're talking about us?" I laughed at the protests at first. As far as I was concerned, they had their hands full monitoring their own practitioners, which turned out to be true as scandals later engulfed Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Bakker, and others. I found it amusing that whenever a televangelist was tempted by the devil, it was usually in a hotel with a hooker. The person you have to watch is the one pointing the finger. I also figured the protests were cynical ploys to get publicity. They used us as a stepping stone to some sort of local and later even national notoriety. Of course, that pointed to the fact that we had indeed become a bona fide phenomenon. We're big enough to warrant some idiot carrying a cross in front of our show? When you're successful, everyone wants some, I guess. Later on, I decided I wanted to counter these people. At times, I thought Gene took things too far by trying to use them to fan the fire. I didn't always think that was a good thing. I disagreed that all publicity was good publicity. Antagonizing these people wasn't the answer. I didn't want to address them individually or give them the importance they were seeking, but I wanted to stop playing the game. I simply wanted to say the allegations weren't true. We were not knights in Satan's service or devil worshippers or anything else. Yes, we had a bass player who spat blood and breathed fire and called himself evil incarnate, but if you went to the movies, you'd also see a guy who wanted to suck your blood, and another with bolts in his neck who'd been brought back to life by a mad scientist and a jolt of electricity. If they saw a guy on TV with his face painted white and his hair pulled up on top of his head and thought he was real and that he was stating facts when he said he was evil incarnate, they were the ones who were crazy, not us. Did these people really think we looked like this all day? Did they also think the guy who played Batman was really Batman? The way I saw it, KISS wasn't going against anything, whether it was religion or politics. KISS wasn't even about rebellion. We didn't tell people to tear anything down or to refuse to play by the rules. We said, become who you want to be. It was about self-empowerment. It was celebratory. For me, it wasn't about fighting the system. It was about picking your path and believing in yourself. The ultimate rebellion wasn't fighting the system. It was circumventing the system and living your life fully. And what the band represented for me personally, I thought it could also represent for other people, for fans. Maybe that's why our audiences were all smiles. We were singing about how good life could be and how much you could accomplish by believing in yourself. Despite what the religious protesters said, KISS was all positivity. Hell, all anyone had to do was listen to the lyrics from our mission statement off Destroyer shouted out loud. Well, the night's begun and you want some fun. Do you think you're going to find it? You got to treat yourself like number one. Do you need to be reminded? If you don't feel good, there's a way you could. Don't sit there broken-hearted. Call all your friends in the neighborhood and get the party started. At the same time religious protesters vilified us for being a danger to America's youth, music critics killed us because in other ways we weren't dangerous enough to ourselves. Apparently, Gene and I didn't live recklessly enough and were too business-minded to meet the credibility criteria of some hip music magazines. The premise that some desk-bound journalist might deem me worthy of his seal of approval only if I played Russian roulette with my life had an irony to it that wasn't lost on me. Drug usage was and is sheer stupidity, and sooner or later there was always a heavy price to pay for it. I wasn't interested in being a dead legend. Our closest contemporaries were Aerosmith. The difference was how we were viewed. They were a rock band, and we were so much more. In some quarters, there was more credibility in being a rock band, but the impact of being an all-encompassing phenomenon was more widespread and diverse. It made us more interesting to newspapers and magazines, little kids, and preachers. The interesting thing was the way that for some people being a phenomenon didn't correlate with being a band, as if it undermined our credibility, as if the impact of the image, the logo, and all the press eclipsed what was otherwise as good as a lot of bands the critics did love. Journalists constantly dismissed us with the same basic argument. If we were any good musically, we wouldn't need any of the visual effects. What never seemed to occur to them was the possibility that we were good and that we wanted and loved all the rest. Part of the perception problem had to do with Neil Bogart and Casablanca Records. The label released Donna Summer's disco anthem, Love to Love You Baby, which became a smash hit over the course of 1976. Hit singles were Neil's thing, and it altered the way he did business. He made Casablanca into a singles-oriented label and focused on acts like the Village People. He signed a rock band called Angel and positioned them as the anti-Kiss in all white outfits and ballet slippers instead of platform boots. Neil's forte once again seemed to be novelty acts not that far removed from his bubblegum days. Kiss went from being the signature band on Casablanca to being part of a sideshow label, part of a menagerie. Instead of being in the company of rock bands, we shared a label with a bunch of guys dressed up like construction workers and cops and a band that wore ballet slippers. People who wanted to see us as pap or contrived had only to look at the company we were in to reinforce their suspicions. It solidified any negative impressions people had of us. Part of the perception problem was due to simple subjective differences in how people saw things. If Bruce Springsteen slid on his knees, critics called it showmanship. If I did, they considered it some sort of scam, a circus trick. One guy was a showman and the other was a charlatan. But sometimes it had a darker side that corresponded to things we overheard, things about how we were money-hungry Jews or kikes, as if our entrepreneurial ability weren't a positive trait, but rather a trait of deceit or manipulation, because that wasn't rock and roll, that was what Jews did. The same sentiments infected the inner workings of the band, too. I think in Peter's case it had to do with his upbringing and the fact that he wasn't very bright. Ace owned a lot of Nazi memorabilia. Now, I'm sure there are people who collect that stuff who aren't Nazis or anti-Semites, but Ace was not one of them. Barely below the surface of the band's interactions was a simmering and ongoing resentment and anger directed at me and Gene. We ran the band and wrote almost all the songs and generated the ideas, not because Kiss was a dictatorship, but because the other guys' contributions just didn't amount to much. Their jealousy and envy and resentment got focused on the most tangible thing they could pin it on, the fact that Gene and I both happened to be Jewish. It wasn't that different from the core of society's anti-Semitism. Take Jewish immigrants out of their native soil and put them in a new country, and the next generation becomes doctors. That's hard for certain people to take, and so it was inside the band. Ace, and particularly Peter, felt powerless and impotent when faced with the tireless focus, drive, and ambition of me and Gene. As a result, the two of them tried to sabotage the band, which, as they saw it, was unfairly manipulated by those money-grubbing Jews. But of course, we kept up the mythology. 4 guys running down the street, jumping in the air, living under one roof. Just substitute New York for Liverpool, and that was us. Yeah. Yeah, right. Chapter 32. I always wanted a gold record, and I always wanted to play Madison Square Garden. I already had my gold album. On February 18th, 1977, we headlined our first show at the Garden, and it was sold out. It had been 4.5 years since I pulled up in front of the Garden in my cab to drop people off for Elvis's show. I had seen the Stones at Madison Square Garden, forged a ticket for that show, in fact. I'd seen George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh at the Garden. I'd slept outside Macy's in Queens to get tickets for that show. I'd seen Alice Cooper at the Garden. I'd seen Ringling Brothers Circus at the Garden. Madison Square Garden was synonymous with success on a large scale. Playing there was big stuff, really big stuff. I was so anxious before the show that I took half a Valium. The idea that I might be sluggish? No chance. The adrenaline high was so strong on a normal night, and this was homecoming in a sold-out Madison Square Garden. I probably could have taken several whole pills and still have gotten up on stage and then run a marathon in record time. Shows like this were still new. I wasn't yet used to the idea that we were this big. Standing on the diving board is usually scarier than taking the dive, and sure enough, once on stage, I felt exhilarated. That first wave of force coming from people screaming and lights coming on is very powerful. Having multitudes of people focused on you and sending you energy creates an undeniable wave of force. That might sound like some sort of New Age concept, but the feeling is staggering. The entire show carried incredible emotional weight, but by the second song, I was home. I knew my parents were in the audience, and I couldn't help chuckling about it. Yep, that's my boy, the one in 8-inch heels and lipstick jerking off a guitar on stage. But I was proving something to them. They were wrong. This could be done, and I had done it. You see, I am special. And then a bottle came sailing out of the darkness and hit me in the head. I saw it at the last second and flinched just enough so it smacked into my head next to my eye instead of in my eye. The glass cut me. I bled for the rest of the show. In some ways, it was cool, but I also felt hurt, not physically, but hurt that somebody would do that, and yet at the same time, I knew it wasn't done maliciously. I'd seen the impulse before. Fans wanted to touch you in any way they could, and here was someone touching me with a bottle. Our road crew, as devoted as they were, found the guy and beat the crap out of him. Still, it was the first time I felt vulnerable on stage. There was always a dark mass of people out there while I was in the spotlight, and now I knew I really could get hurt. For the first time, it occurred to me that the fourth wall could be knocked down by them instead of by me. We had about a week in New York around that gig at the Garden, and once again I was confronted with the fact that I didn't have any real life outside the band. Most musicians I knew wanted to talk about equipment, stuff I could give a rat's ass about. I thought there was so much more to the world, even if I was still learning what that could be. I like to talk about music, but on a historical level, an emotional level, not a technical level. I spent a lot of time dissatisfied because I didn't have friends to talk to about things that might be stimulating, educational, or enlightening. As far as the women I hooked up with, I knew it wasn't about deep conversation. I chose them because of what I thought other people would think and because of what I hoped I could convince myself. I must be somebody worthwhile because this beautiful woman wants to be with me. It was all about bolstering my sense of self. Being with someone to make myself feel better always meant being with a woman others wanted, a woman others envied me for having. Thankfully, I managed to meet some women who, besides being beautiful, were also smart, funny, and well-read. But even with those women, I had little to offer in terms of a relationship. I wasn't open, and I wasn't going to give anything of myself. So it was more or less two people trading services. Though it was hard for me to articulate, all of this made me feel even more isolated than I already felt. I remember one woman coming to my apartment and starting to get itchy for cocaine after a while. She apparently had a major habit. She began to get dressed to go out and score some blow. "I'll come right back," she said. "If you leave," I told her, "you don't come back." You can be with somebody and still feel alone. For me, actually being alone was worse. One evening, I drove my burgundy Mercedes down to a hip restaurant and bar, one of those places that was known as a hangout. I pulled up to the curb near the entrance on 5th Avenue and 11th Street and then sat in my car. I wanted to go in, maybe talk to some people, hang out, but I froze. You can't go in there on your own. I didn't know anyone. I couldn't risk being in a situation like that. I couldn't make friends. I couldn't hang out. The Star Child? Yes, of course he could, and even the version of the Star Child I could muster at parties put on by promoters or radio stations or our own management. Those were controlled situations. People in that context expected the Star Child. I depended on being the Star Child to interact with them. I depended on presenting a likable persona and hid my real self, the one-eared kid from Queens who still didn't believe anyone could really like him and wouldn't know what to do if someone did. Who am I? Where do I belong? I was supposed to be a big rock star, and there I was paralyzed in my car outside a restaurant, afraid to go inside. The contrast between how I was perceived and the reality of my situation could not have been more stark. Who would believe this? With a last look at the entrance, I pulled away from the curb, drove around the block, and steered the car back uptown to my apartment. I didn't have the basic skills to function in a setting like that. Most people were petrified by the idea of going on stage, not me. Whatever emptiness or insecurities I had waited at the side of the stage. I lived for those moments. I wanted the crowd to love me because I still hadn't learned to love myself enough to get over the most basic social phobias I harbored off stage. When are we going back out on the road? Mercifully, we headed back out soon, and by March we found ourselves touching down in Japan in a Pan Am 747 amidst a Beatles-like furor over the band. In fact, it was the Beatles' records we broke for attendance at the Budokan in Tokyo. The magnitude of our stardom in Japan was astounding. We had arranged to pass through customs and immigration in full makeup and gear. We had it all with us on the plane and got ready when we were within a few hours of landing. But we arrived late, and the official who was supposed to be there to smooth everything along had already left. Without him, we had to remove our makeup before they'd let us in the country. After they verified we were the people in our passport photos, we did the quickest makeup job we had ever done and then walked out to find thousands of fans waiting outside. It was pandemonium. Once we got into our cars, people swarmed over them like locusts. I got nervous and claustrophobic. "Smile," Jean said calmly through clenched teeth. We spent the next 2 weeks attending lavish parties and making regular visits to Japanese bathhouses. The bathhouses employed women who seemed to grow extra hands and limbs once your clothes were off. If I could do to myself what they did to me, I would never leave home. While in Japan, I met with executives from Hoshino Gakki, the makers of Ibanez guitars. We sat in a boardroom and I explained my views on the sonics and aesthetics of guitars, which led to my first signature model. Having my own guitars sold in music stores around the world was a milestone for me, and any musician. After the last show, we flew back to Los Angeles. There, we learned we'd been named the top band in America by the Gallup poll over Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, and the Eagles, among others. Soon magazines were publishing similar results from readers' polls. In Circus magazine, we won a head-to-head poll versus Zeppelin. Now, I had a high regard for what we were doing, but I wasn't crazy. I didn't see us in the same league as Zeppelin. The same publications also ran votes on readers' favorite players, and Ace and Peter both came out on top of some best guitarist and best drummer polls, fueling the increasing gap between their self-image and their actual abilities. If only circus readers realized they were barely sentient beings most of the time who didn't care and were often either too fucked up or too inept to play their parts on recordings without great effort or a nameless ringer filling in for them. I figured if we were going to disregard the critics who called us hucksters and dismissed our music, we also had to dismiss the people who called us virtuosos. Peter and Ace didn't agree. The press reinforced what they wanted to think, that they were world-class musicians. Of course, Ace could really have been one, but he was killing his talent and his body and brain with booze and drugs. And Peter, from Destroyer on, what the band wanted to do, push the limits of his abilities or simply outstrip them. We had a few weeks off in LA before we went to New York to start recording yet another album. One night I ended up going out with Lita Ford, who was then the guitar player in the Runaways. Lita and I had some fun times together. She was only 19, but her band had just released their second album and were about to head off for their own tour of Japan. The two of us went to a club called the Starwood for a show. The opening band, The Boys, featured George Lynch, who went on to fame in the band Dokken. The Boys played a cover of Detroit Rock City. The second band was called Van Halen. They had another show the next night, and I made Gene go with me to see them. Near the end of Van Halen's set that second night, Gene got up and disappeared. Little did I know he'd gone backstage and spoken to them about taking them into a studio to record a demo. He never told me. He didn't mention it when he returned to his seat. I found out only later. It was funny because I always thought of Gene as the one member of the band I could count on, and yet he still did secretive things like that. It was that old impulse of his, and he never felt the need to explain any of what I saw as sneaky or dishonest behavior. During that time in California, I also met and started seeing Cher's sister, Georgianne LaPierre, who was then starring in the soap opera General Hospital. Georgianne was extremely smart, a member of the high IQ society Mensa, and I loved talking with her. Georgiana and I saw each other off and on for more than a year, though after a while, I told her I planned to see other people as well. There was no dishonesty about it. I realized phone relationships could go on forever. You talk to somebody, have a nice conversation, and then, when you say goodnight, you go off and do whatever you're going to do. At the end of the time in L.A., I flew to New York. The song Love Gun came to me in its entirety on the flight. Melody, lyrics, all the instrument parts, absolutely complete. It was amazing and rare for me. I stole the idea of a love gun from Albert King's version of The Hunter, which Zeppelin also nicked from for How Many More Times on their first album. By the time the plane landed, I was ready to record a demo. When I got to New York, I called a drummer I knew and went almost immediately to Electric Lady to record the song. By this point, I didn't need to do demos in less lavish studios. I could do them in top-end studios, and Electric Lady was my favorite. I used the same equipment and tape that other bands cut masters on. That worked out to be as much of a curse as a blessing. Sure, the demo sounded great, but with using quality studios for demos came the risk of demo-itis. You get so locked into the version you record as a demo that you lose all flexibility when it comes time to record the track. You've worked out all the parts, and it's hard to erase them and let other people have creative input if they veer from the version you recorded on the demo. Then you're stuck recording a stiff version of the thing you already did. It robs the final recording of spontaneity. You're less open to suggestions for change because you already have a fully realized concept. Eventually, in the late 1980s, I stopped doing demos for all those reasons. The funny thing about Love Gun was that even though the album version was recorded as a facsimile of the demo, when we went to cut the album version, Peter couldn't play the kick drum pattern on the song. Once Peter cut the track, we had to bring in another drummer to play the extra kick drum beats Peter couldn't. We recorded the album at the Record Plant, another iconic New York studio. It was up near Times Square in what at the time wasn't a great neighborhood. When you entered the place at the ground level, the receptionist was sitting behind a glass window and had to buzz you in through a locked door. The window had shutters, and once through the locked door, you saw the reception area was separated from the hallway by another locked door. I can't tell you how many times I left the studio to take a break and walked into the receptionist's little office. She would close the shutters and lock the door and say, "Oh, Paul." I didn't fool myself into thinking I was the only one, but I was one, and it was terrific. Sure beat a coffee break. During our stay in New York, Gene came up to Bill's office and played us finished demos by a band called Daddy Longlegs. It turned out that was a name he came up with to replace their original one, Van Halen. Bill and I listened intently and later spoke, without Gene, and agreed to pass on getting involved with them, not because they weren't great, not because they didn't have enormous potential. We passed to protect KISS, which needed our daily focus to continue building on all fronts. Gene's wandering eye was clearly a potential risk to all we had accomplished and all we were working toward.